Okay, so we've covered the basics of networking in the previous topics, and today we are going to be looking at some red teaming. So what's the difference between a bind shell and a reverse shell? So a shell basically allows you to remotely execute commands on a different machine. So for today's setup, we actually have the victim, which is using a Windows PC at the top over here, and then we have the attacker, which is using a Linux PC on the bottom over here. And then we'll be using our network diagram over here to illustrate what's happening. Okay, so to start with, let's assume that the attacker is in this home network over here. Okay, so let's quickly annotate. So the attacker is over here. Okay, and then the victim is actually in this corporate network. Okay, so possibly the attacker maybe has sent a payload, and then the victim has opened up the payload and then is executing a command. So how does the attacker actually receive the shell? So we are going to be looking at a reverse shell first. So that's the first scenario that we will be looking at. Okay, so what the attacker has to do is the attacker has to open up a listener and have that listener open at all time, and to make sure that it is able to receive when the victim actually opens up that document. So for this case, we are going to open up, we are going to listen on port 80. So how it works is on this end of things, let's say this is port 80 over here, and it's actually port forwarded to our laptop over here, and then our laptop is over here, and we're actually running that cat, and we are listening for any connections that is coming in on port 80. Okay. And then on our victim machine here, let's say our victim has opened up, the payload, and is actually connecting to us. So what this command here, netcat, actually does is opens a network connection, and it actually pipes in, the output for cme.exe, which is the command prompt. So what we are assuming over here is that if we come over to our network over here, so we are assuming that this IP address over here, resolves to in.verilog.linkbenjamin.com. And then let's say our attacker is running on this HP workstation over here. So netcat is running over here, and then it's trying to connect to this on port 80. And then it will actually be port forwarded to where our attacker is listening. And once it's port forwarded, once the connection has been set up, it will actually spawn up cmd.exe. And then our attacker will be able to execute commands on cmd.exe over here. Execute commands. Okay. So this is exactly what we'll be demonstrating over here. So let's let the attacker, the victim, open up the document. Okay, immediately we can see we have received a connection, and we have control over the victim's machine over here. So if if we type who am I, we're actually masquerading as the victim itself already. Yeah, and of course if we exit over here, the connection will actually drop. And so in a lot of cases over here, they might put in some persistency so that let's say there's a scheduled task, something like that starts this on a regular basis, and then you would open up this, and then you wait for it to call back, and then you'll be able to execute commands on the victim's machine. And so basically this is the idea of a reverse shell. Reverse shell is a lot easier to plan out to execute, because victim connecting out towards a random address on port 80 or 443 is actually very common. It's like the victim surfing a web, and it's a lot harder to actually block or to detect. Yeah, especially if 443 is used, encryption is used, things like that. And so this is a lot of a more common setup, especially if the attacker doesn't have a foothold in the corporate network. They will try to attempt a reverse shell, basically. Yeah. Okay, let's do a bit of a cleanup over here. Okay, so for our second scenario over here, we will not be looking at a reverse shell anymore, where it's the attacker trying to reverse back to the it's the victim trying to reverse back to the attacker. We will look at a bind shell, and this is commonly at a later stage of the compromise. And normally for a bind shell, it'll be somewhere placed, let's say on a web server here. So the prerequisite for a bind shell is that the port must be open. So on the attacker's machine, it's very easy to do a port forward, but on a victim's machine, it may not be that easy, because you would have to compromise maybe the firewall or something like that, or it's already an open port. Maybe port 80 is being mapped into here, and so there's nothing listening on port 80, because it's risky to kill a service that is already listening there, because it reveals the presence. But if there's nothing opening on port 80, and we have compromised the web server, what we can do is assuming now this is the victim here. The victim is on the web server already. And what we can do is actually, we can actually on the victim machine itself run, this. And what is happening is that, any connection that comes into port 80 would actually spawn up CMD or EXE. This is a bit risky as well, because not only you can connect to it, anybody else on the internet that is trying to connect on port 80 might also end up at this web server and then have a shell that you can execute stuff on. And in this case now, so it's going to be slightly different now. So our attacker now would not be trying to will not be listening and waiting for the connection to happen. And what will happen is that the attacker would immediately go straight to here on port 80. And how this will look like is in here itself, we would actually directly connect to this IP address of port 80. So for now, what we are assuming here is that this corporate network here, the IP address is actually the IP address that we are trying to connect to over here. So this is 192.168.10.162, and so we are actually connecting all the way here, and we are connecting port 80. And over here, NC is listening, and then it will spawn up a CMD. And so what happens if we are trying to connect and we connect over here, immediately you'll get the shell. And over here again, there is a connection that comes from our source address over here. And once again, we can execute commands. And once you're happy with it, we can kill it. Yeah. And so these are the basics of how a bind shell and a reverse shell works. And I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you.